Have you noticed how horror films always echo what is happening historically in the world, whether that be societal changes, fear in technology, social and political advancements? That can all be seen echoed in our favorite horror films, and I want to get into that today. So get your, not protractor, what's it called with the thing? Monocles on, and your hats, the smart people hats. What are they called? Get those on, because we're going to do a deep dive into how we see horror echoed in history. If you're new, my name's Amelia. Hello, and I'm going to talk about everything spooky dooky and deep divey. So if you're also a spooky dooky human and you like horror and alternative culture, please hit that subscribe button, because we're gonna get into some fun. Let's start off our journey talking about gothic horror. So of course we are seeing Nosferatu in cinemas at the moment, and Bill Skarsgård did a lot of things for me in that film. I don't know if am I scared to admit it? His heart. And obviously that film is done ridiculously well, spurring the conversation on what was the actual Nosferatu like in 1922 when it first came out. A lot of film goers that hadn't seen the original Nosferatu were like, this wasn't scary, what the hell is this? There's nothing spooky about this. But the reason why silent cinema was so scary back in the day is it was bringing on a new and different dread that people hadn't seen reflected in film before. These films didn't need blood or gore or overalls, eerie visuals, because there was a psychological dread to them, often reflecting the trauma of World War I. Another really key part or stamp in our timeline to look is the 19th century as well. In the 19th century, there was an industrial revolution when it came to science, and a lot of scientific advancement was happening, which of course freaked people the hell out. So this was completely new for the people in the 19th century. So a lot of people were really anxious, like, how is science going to interweave with how we live every day, and how is it going to interweave with nature? Will human beings survive? Spoiler alert, yes. Think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, how they exploited people's fears of science, reanimated corpses. What are you going to be able to do when science is a real thing? There was the rise of Gothic literature, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein. These films showed what happened when you played God, and of course they had some dire consequences. In this stage of horror, you really saw what happened when people's fears were reflected on screen, and fear of the unknown really got magnified. I mean, I can't imagine how scary it would be, because I'd be like, is someone going to reanimate like a corpse or something in front of my eyeballs? Like, this was a really scary time for people. One thing I really want to highlight as a lover of creepy and just messed up cartoons was the Great Depression, which started around 1929. A lot of people seem to forget this period of Disney and link this to the Great Depression, because this is where we saw Disney films and Mickey Mouse being completely weird and creepy. So a little bit of insight into the Great Depression. Now, a lot of things happened in the Great Depression, and this is not a history video. It kind of is a history video actually, but it's not on history like that. It's horror history. And what we saw in the Great Depression a little bit was, it was a massive cultural crash basically. Loads of crap happened, which led to a lot of people struggling for jobs, struggling for food, struggling for everything. It was a really, really shit moment in history. And what we saw was a lot of cartoon studios capitalizing on this fear and making really dark imagery for people to watch. We had Snow White coming out in 1933. Those creepy visuals of her running through the forest was not to be trifled with. The awesome skeleton dance coming out in 1929. But something I really, really want to talk about, one of my favorite Mickey Mouse shorts was called The Mad Doctor, which came out in 1933. So The Mad Doctor, like I said, was a short that came out from Disney in 1933, and this really blurred humor and also just dark imagery. We see Mickey Mouse being operated on, and it was just absolutely creepy. It's on YouTube if you want to see the whole thing. This section is called Gothic Horror Resurgence. There was still a lot of anxiety around this time due to science and what was happening with science and what's going to be made next. People were freaking scared, and Hammer Studios really capitalized on that. People wanted to see monsters. We had the Universal monsters, but Hammer also had their own monsters as well. I might talk about that in another video. These horror films that were coming out in the 1950s and 1970s, they were pushing boundaries. We had graphic violence on scene. We had sexualized tone. People couldn't get enough of it. Now you had the Universal monsters that were black and white, but also the Hammer monsters that were coming out. They were different. They were colorful, and people, like I said, were gravitating towards them. Now we're going into the 1950s and 1960s, because we had something called the Cold War, and also societal upheaval was happening in this time frame as well. By the 1950s, everyone was gripped by the Cold War and also nuclear advancements and being like, what's happening now? There was a lot of fear about what was happening with nuclear power. And of course, with the fear of science and everything that happened before, like we spoke about, and the Great Depression, this was different because now we had fear in nuclear. So we had sci-fi horror coming to the forefront. People, again, were really tripped out and freaked out in the Cold War. They were scared about what the government might be hiding from us. What's going on? What don't you know? What's my neighbor eating for dinner? I need to know. People were scared that danger was lurking in plain sight and they wouldn't know until it was too late. You had notable films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers in this time frame. The 1960s brought even more social upheaval. People were tired, and you had, of course, the civil rights movement happening in this time frame as well. But also the 1960s and 70s brought sexual liberation, and you saw this in Psycho in 1960. She was naked in the shower. God damn. This was completely new to see in horror and completely revolutionized how we saw women's bodies on screen. So Alfred Hitchcock, of course, created Psycho and directed Psycho, and this completely span out people's brain boxes. There was sexual violence, there was taboos being broken, there was, of course, psychological depth in the film, and if you hadn't seen the film, that ending, imagine watching the ending of Psycho back in the 60s. Imagine people seeing that. So, of course, like I said, we had the civil rights movement happening in this time frame as well. And Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968. And in that film, we have the awesome Ben, played by the absolute icon, Dwayne Jones. And he was our first black male protagonist that we've ever had in a horror film. And a lot of people, if you've seen the ending, you know what I'm going to say, a lot of people thought that that was because of the racial tension and because of the civil rights movement. It actually wasn't. So Ben, of course, like I said, was played by a black guy, but he wasn't really meant to be played by a black guy. George A. Romero said he just wanted the best actor that was good for the job, and it happened to be Dwayne Jones. Because of the racial tension that was happening, that completely put another spin on how you see the ending of that film. Now, of course, this video is all about historical moments that have been echoed in horror films, and like I said, the sole purpose of Night of the Living Dead wasn't to show a black person and what happened at the end. Dwayne Jones was just the best person for the job. But what happened in history is we had in 1968, in 1968, the Race Relations Act. This act was meant to stop discrimination in the UK and also show that black people could get housing, employment, whatever they wanted. So that was that act. In the 1970s, things took another turning point for horror. Let's keep turning those points. We had satanic panic. Everyone was going crazy in the 70s. Everyone was living, laughing, and loving. Everyone was enjoying themselves. And we had that little glimmer of satanic panic with bands as well. In the 1970s, we started to see horror blurring the lines to what was real and what wasn't. People was confused. Is this actually factual or is it not? What's going on? Because the Vietnam War was first broadcasted into people's homes. This was gritty, this was real, this was dark, this is what was happening live in your freaking homes on your TV set. So people were starting to think, what's going on, what is real, what is not, when it comes to horror films. And we saw that reflected in films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, and also The Exorcist in 1973. People were not only shocked by the imagery, oh no, that wasn't the other thing, people also were shocked with what was happening, whether it was real or not. Like, is this a real exorcism that's happening on Reagan, like on this little girl? What's going on? Is there actually a guy called Leatherface slicing people up in Texas? Who knows? And of course it was kind of like, it was inspired by a real life offer, but that's another video. In 1972, we had the Watergate scandal, which led to a lot of mistrust in the government and a lot of like, what the hell are you guys doing? Tell us again. And we saw films that happened like The Wicker Man in 1973. Again, a film about a group of people living autonomously and just by themselves, not like really just living by themselves. And then we also had Jaws that came out in 1975. Now hold my hand as we go into the 1980s. This was gore. This was freaking masked killers. This was hidden identities. This was satanic panic. This was what the 1980s was all about, and people were absolutely terrified. We saw the rise of the slasher films happening in 1980, the rise of masked killers, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. Who were these people behind the masks and the burns? Who knows? This introduced audiences to brand new graphic violence with brand new cutting edge technology for the time. People couldn't believe what the frick they were seeing on screen. Advancements in practical effects were also on screen. Look at the thing, the chest bursting bit. That was completely new for people. And because of these advancements in graphic natures, practical effects, grossness on screen, blah. This in 1982 led to Video Nasties, a list of 72 horror films that were banned from our British eyeballs. There's so many films on this list. Of course, like I said, there was 72, but notable ones to say was Possession, The Evil Dead, Bay of Blood, Maniac. They were all on there. You also, of course, had satanic panic that happened when it came to the music world. People were like, don't listen to Led Zeppelin, don't play the Beatles backwards, they'll tell you to gouge your eyeball out. I don't know what they're saying, but they were saying things like that. That also was echoed in horror films as well. You had people freaking out, parents are freaking out about what the kids were watching and what the kids were listening to. This led to films like Trick or Treat, which is Corey Taylor's favorite film, actually, just to let you know. Just like the 1970s, in the 1990s, we saw another resurgence of people being like, is this real or not? This was the dawn of the found footage. We saw things like the Blair Witch Project, where people thought that this footage actually was real. 1990, we also saw horror taking another step forward in films like Scream. This was an awesome film, of course, that looked at the satire behind what we'd seen in horror tropes before leading up to this point. Massive Ghosty fan. This meta approach to horror films had people thinking about how they've been delivered horror films all the way up into the 1990s, and the hilarity in that and the tropes and everything was obviously Scream is sick. Had films, of course, like the awesome Candyman, which explored themes of systemic racism, urban decay, gentrification. Massive theme in Candyman. Psychological tension was also multiplied and magnified as well, like I said, with the Blair Witch Project, but also we saw a different type of horror being introduced there as well. What was real and what was not again, because this time it was far more hard to detect what was real and what wasn't in the 1990s. And of course, 2000s to 2010s was just absolutely horrible. We saw events like 9/11, of course, which casted a long shadow over horror. Themes of loss of control, social collapse, themes of terrorism, these were all bleeding their way into horror. You had films like 28 Days Later, Pandemics, Cloverfield in 2008, which captured the fear and terror in a post-9/11 world. You also saw a new fear being introduced. We had the torture corn come into forefront. Films like Saw, films like Hostel. This was another thing for us to be scared about, and yeah, audiences freaking loved it. This had you thinking, what would I do if you think of like films like Hostel? What would you do if you went to a freaking hostel with your mates and this all happened? This was a brand new fear. The way that Hostel really played into the fear of 9/11 was traveling, going somewhere, leaving the confines of where you know, the States, obviously, like I said, in Hostel. That was a brand new fear that was being reflected to us back on screen. A massive thing that happened, of course, in the 2000s to 2010s was the internet, and people were freaking scared. I remember I went to a party, I was far too young, but it's all about Y2K and like the world just like crashing in 2000. So silly to remember now. As the internet became incorporated in people's everyday life, we saw films like Fear.com, which came out in 2002. We also had Unfriended, which came out in 2014. These tackled themes of cyberstalking, the deep web, loss of privacy, no one's got privacy anymore. Just like we saw in those early days of Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we were seeing fear of sci-fi again, but this time it was sci-fi and also technology. This marked a new way and another shift in horror, because the digital age was something that we couldn't control, because at this point we just didn't know enough about it. Now, all the way up to modern day, horror continues to push boundaries now even more than ever. We look at all these past fears that we've spoken about up until now, and now horror can incorporate a number of those fears all into one film. Today's horror is more diverse, more boundary pushing than ever. There's so many more things to be scared about and directors really are taking notice of that. We see directors paying attention and looking at things like systemic racism in Get Out, of course, by Jordan Peele. We have social media and of course the pandemic in films like Host, such a good film. We're also seeing films thrive globally. The Train to Busan, The Babadook, Pig, what else we got? Oh, The Awesome, The Loved Ones. These films are also part of our horror makeup now. We're seeing films with the fear of AI like Dancing Megan. Like, that's coming, Megan 2.0 is coming out this year, isn't it? Do you think that's going to be good? I don't know. And of course, a massive film that happened this year, The Substance, speaking about celebrity, how women are seen in this new world of trying to be perfect and trying to look perfect all the time. The Substance was absolutely phenomenal for those themes. And we've never seen things like that shown so blatantly and raw before in a horror film. This is how females, this is how women actually feel. Each generation delivers us a brand new scoop of fear, and we just keep getting that. And I'm so excited to see what we're going to be be getting next. There's so many more things to talk about, but I can rant about horror for so long. So if you do like this and you're still with me, please do subscribe for these deep dives. And I can't wait to see what's going to be coming out next in the horror genre, because where we are now, we just continually keep pushing those boundaries, scooping in and including everything that we've learned as horror lovers now. And it's such an exciting time to be a horror lover. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.